much for joining us tonight. We'll give folks another minute or so to hop into the room. Then we'll go ahead and just welcome our guests. We'll skip sort of introductions this time so that we can get right into our panel. I'm not going to share my deck at all during the panel because I want you to be able to see our speakers' faces fully. And then once we get through the panel, I'll switch over to screen sharing so we can talk through some of the details we've got to get in order for guiding principles and our community engagement. Welcome everyone to this, our third meeting of the Social Studies Standards Advisory Committee for the District of Columbia. I want to welcome my co-chair, Karen Williams, representative from Ward 7, all of our members who are able to join us tonight, and our esteemed panelists who are really excited to be here with us tonight and very graciously giving us their time at the start of academic years and all the other things we know they have going on. We're going to start our evening with the panel. We'll go through the panelists and ask them each to give an introductory statement of roughly 4 to 5 minutes. Then I'll ask a question, and we're going to go then to a facilitated Q&A with the members. What I'd ask members to do is, as you're listening and as questions arise, put them in the chat and chat it out to everyone. If you see a question you really like and want to make sure it gets asked, go ahead and give it a +1, just tag the person's name and +1 it, so that those of us on the staff watching can figure out how to order the questions and make sure we use our time really efficiently. We'll end with a closing question for the panelists and make sure we can send our panelists off right at 6 o'clock. I know Dr. Allen has another engagement she has to jump to. And then we'll dive in on the rest of our agenda for the evening. This meeting is being recorded. It's also being live streamed on our YouTube. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to our panelists, and I'll just ask you to introduce yourselves. All of the members have your bios in tonight's presentation deck, which they got ahead of time, as well as a brief descriptor on our agenda. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Allen.
Great, thanks very much. And I do have a couple of slides. Is it okay if I share my screen to go through them?
Sure.
I'll keep it to my 4 to 5 minutes. Okay.
Absolutely. Caitlin, do I need to give permission for that, or is that all set already?
Oh, actually, it turns
like magic.
Okay, great, beautiful. Thank you so much. Okay, and this will give me a chance to say who I am as well. So I'm Danielle Allen. I direct the Edmund J. Stafford Center for Ethics at Harvard. I'm a political philosopher. We have an initiative called the Democratic Knowledge Project, which is a K through 16 civic education provider. We offer curriculum development, professional development, and assessment tools and services, all in support of education for constitutional democracy. We have an overarching vision to use high quality civics curricula and pedagogy to build a supermajority of the population, so at least 67%, who believe democracy is essential and feel confident in having the knowledge and skills they need to participate. So I want to stress those words. We care about motivation. We want kids to feel interested, committed, engaged in the practices of our democracy. They then need knowledge and skills in order to be effective in their roles as civic participants and citizens. To connect this to the language of education, we do build on the deeper learning sort of theories and frameworks for our thought about civic education. And that means as we build out curricula, we focus on the motivation part, and that's a matter of identity. What kinds of civic attitudes and dispositions do people have? We focus on mastery of content knowledge, disciplinary knowledge, that's civic knowledge, that's your traditional content that you're used to thinking about, 3 branches of government, political institutions, philosophical foundations of democracy. We also care about skills and then creative use of skills. So civic learning, social studies is about becoming a participant in society broadly, and that is as much about doing as it is about knowing and the integration of knowing and doing. We are a wonderful group of people I love to work with. We have lots of fun working in a co-design process. I will skip all of that now, but just to say, we in social studies is where universities and colleges and researchers can come together with educators and work together on designing innovative social studies curricula. STEM education for the last 20 years has gotten a lot of infusion of knowledge from researchers in STEM fields like biology and so forth. We haven't had the same chance to bring political scientists and historians and sociologists and demographers and economists into connection with educators to build innovative social studies curricula, and it really is time for that. So for our work, we do focus on civic education in the broad span of social studies. And as I said, that's got the three parts: social and emotional learning, that is connected to that motivation piece, that identity concept, dispositions and attitudes; civic knowledge, which is about the content standards; and civic skills. We do think project-based learning is a good framework for social studies. And the reason for this is because there is a bit of a debate in the field of social studies about whether the work should be really about knowledge and content or about things like civic action and participation. We think those things belong together in a fully merged paradigm. And our view is that project-based learning provides great tools for doing that. So we focus on authentic projects, projects that give our young students a chance to do real things in the world, whether that's to take the role of a lawyer or a constitutional designer or an advocate, a petition writer. And they have voice and choice in how the projects are shaped up, including, in some cases, the research questions that they pursue in order to master core disciplinary content. We want to give them a lot of space for reflection. Social studies is about our world, and so it is about having an opinion about our world, an informed, well-argued, well-reasoned opinion, but reflection is really critical. It matters that our students share their work with bigger audiences and that they think about that sharing. So the issue of digital tools for sharing is really critical. Digital media literacy is a hugely important part of social studies at this point in time, because that is where young people face real challenges about how to think about how they share their opinions about our contemporary world. Critique and revision is a key part of the process for us. Collaborative work, again, all the work in the space of civics is about becoming a person who is ready to participate in joint decision making in our broader civic and community structures. And then sustained inquiry is another key element of what we look for in designing our curricula. So I'm not going to go over the kinds of tools that we develop for doing this. I just want to call out a few other principles of our approach, things that we think matter for high quality social studies curricula. We do think that authentic and informed civic agency, which is the goal, comes from authentic learning experiences. And again, that's where students have the chance to encounter real world problems, to take on real world roles, even as they're learning traditional content. So for that reason, we do seek to integrate content-oriented civic knowledge with action civics approaches in our curriculum. With regard to social emotional learning, we focus on the development of young people as equitable, effective, and self-protective civic agents. So motivated to participate, effective in knowing how to collaborate with others, how to speak publicly, how to share their work with a broader public, but also understanding the ways in which the digital environment can expose one to bullying, to bad behavior. And so the need to learn skills of self-protection with regard to bullying, self-protection from bad information, poorly sourced information, and things like that. So again, I'm really emphasizing digital media literacy is a really important part of social studies. As I said at the top, we do think that this is a really important moment in social studies to build co-design processes that link people from research communities to educators. That there's a real chance to do exciting things that really are highly engaging for young people if we pursue those co-design activities. And then we really want to underscore that any new social studies curriculum really depends on investment in communities of practice. Sometimes it can seem that the work is just about writing the standards or then writing curricula that flow off the standards. But the truth is that any successful implementation is about a community of practice learning together and deepening the understanding both of the content knowledge and the pedagogic practices. So we would really encourage you as you do your work for social studies for DC to focus on the question of how do you invest in a community of practice in the districts that you serve. So in sum, we aim to integrate disciplinary mastery of traditional civics content with agency-oriented approaches to civic education grounded in a diversity of perspectives. And I haven't talked as much about that diversity of perspectives thus far, but so I'll conclude there just to say that this is the time in social studies curricula for us not to have a curriculum that really focuses only on your traditional, say, white male historical leaders, nor is it a moment where what we should do is sort of check the box diversity, where you sort of make sure you've got a little bit of this and a little bit of that. The time has come for us to tell a fully integrated story of our nation's history, by which I mean at any historical point you're looking at, tell the story from all the perspectives that are relevant then, from the perspectives of power holders, from the perspectives of the disempowered. Those perspectives can be integrated into a single story, and the scholarly resources are there now to tell that integrated story. And that applies not just to history, but also to core concepts. If, for example, you're doing work in civics and you're thinking about the concept of representation, that concept and idea has different meanings depending on different people's backgrounds and where they're situated in relationship to our social life. So we can integrate our civics learning, we can integrate sociology, economics across the board if we give care to that. So here's to civic education and social studies more broadly that inspires, motivation, enlightens, that's the knowledge part, and empowers, delivers skills that people can put to use. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. I have a bunch of questions that I'm excited to follow up on that, but I'm going to hand it next to Dr. Jeffries to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about his work.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be with you, and thank you especially for the work that you all are doing. I want to pick up almost exactly where Dr. Allen left off, and that is talking about fully integrating the story. One of the things that is clear when we look at, by the way, I teach history at Ohio State University, and I've been working with the Southern Poverty Law Center, focusing more on the knowledge and the information that we share. In particular, not only what do we teach, but also how do we teach it as well. And one of the things that is clear based upon the way in which we have taught history, American history, and what we haven't taught about the other aspects of American history, one of the results is that our students more easily and readily identify with oppressors than the oppressed. They more easily identify with enslavers than with the enslaved. All you have to do is take a walk around Washington, D.C. and compare the number of monuments to people who were in fact enslavers versus monuments to people who were enslaved, and you see the gap. And so it's not a surprise that one of the things that we have to wrestle with in the classroom is an empathy gap. We have children who are unable, because they're unable to identify with people who live on the margins of American society, have lived on the margins of American society, are able to actually empathize with their experiences, with their struggles. So the question then becomes, how do you generate that in a way for them to understand, for our children, for our young people to understand the value of their experiences, of people's experiences in the past, and what they can draw on those experiences to both understand the present and shape the future. So one of the things that we have been focusing on is this idea of hard history, those aspects of the American past that usually center around race and racism, but for which we as a nation are reluctant to engage with both honestly and directly. So we're talking about slavery. We're talking about Jim Crow. We're talking about the history of racial terrorism in American society. We're talking about white supremacy during the civil rights era and beyond. We have a friend who is a literary performer up in Boston. Some of you may be familiar with him. His name is Reggie Gibson. And he said, our problem as Americans is we actually hate history. He said, what we love is nostalgia. And there's a big difference between the two, because nostalgia is really stories of the past that make us feel comfortable in the present. And so we push back hard against those aspects of the past that cause us to question not only our identity individually and nationally, but also the decisions that we make in society today. And so the work that I've been doing, the work that I've been in partnership with both teachers and school districts and Southern Poverty Law Center and other places has been, how do we confront hard history? How do we get our schools, our teachers, our school districts, in essence, to say, you know what, we cannot understand the present, forget about even trying to understand the past unless we confront hard history directly. This is starting with slavery and moving forward. It's the time for pretending that, what I call historical amnesia, purposeful historical amnesia is done. The time for rationalizing evil, which we have done in the past, all those were, those enslavers were just simply men or women of their times, didn't know any better. And the time for making up false narratives is also done. The lost cause and being foremost among them. And saying, okay, if we're going to tackle this history accurately, honestly, and effectively, and this is 2 points and I'll wrap up. What do we have to do in the classroom? One, obviously, we have to teach truth. But equally important, we have to scaffold this teaching, right? So that means there's never an age. We know psychologists tell us that children are able to identify people by race as early as 2 and 3 months old, picking up on the cues and signals of their caregivers and parents. So there's, we can't fall into the colorblind trap. So there is no age that it's actually too early to begin to talk about questions that intersect with race and power and fairness and the like. And so when we're teaching this history, we do have to scaffold it, meaning thinking about vertical integration, starting at the youngest ages and then building up. We don't teach the basics. We don't wait until we're in high school to teach the basics of physics. We're literally teaching that in kindergarten and preschool and the like. We have to do the same thing with social studies. We have to do the same thing with this hard history. And we also have to think about scaffolding vertically, vertical integration. So this isn't just a social studies issue. We need to be teaching and reinforcing hard history in all of our subjects, in English language arts, in music, in science, in math, so that students realize that this is something that they have to fully understand and fully embrace as they move through their K through 12 education. And so I'll leave it at there, and I look forward to the questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jeffries. I'm going to come next to Dr. Thomas Brown.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Thomas Brown. I'm a professor of social studies and multicultural education in the U of M system, University of Michigan system. And I was one of the writers of the C3 framework. So what I'm going to do is just give you a quick rundown. Once you get the information you want, then we can go from there. So the C3 framework, we started working on it back in 2011. And I'm looking at my slide down here. I can share that with the group later on, so you can have a look at what the framework looks like. You can also find the C3 framework document itself online, as well as if you go to C3 Teachers, which has samples of lessons, samples of standards applied to lessons for social studies. So it's all available to you online, but I can make those links available later on as well. So the C3 framework, the essence of it is, when we started doing this work, we looked at college, career, life. How can we take our students from one point to the other, all the way through school, and then focus on it? A part of the problem we came across is most social studies standards are written in this massive, highfalutin language. It's extremely complicated. It has multiple sections, and it just does not work. And see, did I tell you guys about my third grader?
They're here.
Yeah, I know. My third grader. You see, the moment he chose to walk in, the moment I start talking. So anyhow, we realized that it used really highfalutin language. And so one of the things we started out by saying, we needed fewer standards, we needed them clearer, we needed them so that a typical teacher could take these standards and apply them to any classroom. And so that was pretty much our mission. We needed to enhance rigor. So we didn't want social studies that was doing the same old, which is not the hard history, not the integrated stuff, not the deep thinking. It was just like, read this chapter, finish this chapter, answer these questions. That wasn't what we wanted. And so we wanted it to be rigorous, but at the same time, we wanted critical thinking, we wanted problem solving. We wanted standards that would allow students to be participatory. So we needed those participatory skills, but at the same time, we wanted it to align to academic programs, but it also needed to be a national framework. So in other words, when we started the C3 framework work, there were maybe 5 or 6 states involved. And that work sort of spiraled out into multiple states as we went along. Now, we looked at the standards and we decided that instead of writing social studies standards, what we were going to write was a framework that guided social studies standards. So in other words, any state could take it and then use it to sort of design their standards. So use it almost like a fundamental springboard for their standards. And so that's the foundation of what we did. And I'm scrolling through my slides that I'll share with you later. And so what we did was, it was simply a group of people, and we literally met in this random, really tiny city in Ohio. Nobody knew we were there. We couldn't tell anybody we were there. We did not want to be lobbied. And we just started writing. We literally started writing. There were 3 geography, 3 civics, 3 economics, and 3 history writers. And we started with what already existed. We looked at the national social studies standards and we decided, okay, how do we now take this, make it simple for everybody else? And this is what we came up with. We came up with a foundation that said we needed to prepare students for college. We needed to prepare them for life. We needed to prepare them for civic engagement. We struggled with terms such as action. How do you take what you learn in a social studies classroom and turn that into action? We then came up with the notion of inquiry, which was not new, but it was new to social studies in the sense that now we're asking students to take a sort of project-based approach where you're learning this, but you're taking it a step further. So how do we do that whole inquiry like you would have done in science? And then we thought about what were the core disciplines. We settled on the 4 core disciplines of social studies. If most of you would have already known, social studies in college and high school is like a multiplicity of disciplines. It's so many that you get lost in it. So we said, what are the 4 core disciplines that define what we do? So we settled on our history, our geography, our civics, and then, which one did I forget? Our economics. We then said, how do we define a historian? How do we define a geographer? And one of the things we came about, for instance, in our geography group, we said, a geographer going through these standards should walk away with the habits of mind of thinking spatially. So how do you get your teachers to think spatially? How do you get your students to think spatially? When we think about history, it's the habits of mind of using evidence-based discussion to sort of direct the conversations in class. It's learning from those past experiences. And so that once we decided what a historian looks like, what a person looks like, we then transitioned into the next level. So we came up with 4 dimensions for the C3 framework. The 4 dimensions we focused on was first, developing questions and planning inquiries. It is from the planning inquiries that we developed what we refer to as the IDM model. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's the inquiry design model. And what we've been doing, what we said we wanted to do was change how we plan lessons for social studies. So if we can change it from a teacher grabbing a book and saying, read this chapter, answer these questions, to say, hey, let's start out with an inquiry. Let's start with a compelling question, for example. And I'll give you one of my favorite compelling questions that came out of this. What's the point of sitting down to stand up? And we use that to teach lessons about civic engagement. We use it to teach lessons about protests. We use it to teach lessons about the civil rights movement. And then we make those tangible connections. And so a student going through the inquiry design model starts out in our first dimension of asking those questions. And then those questions stimulate thought. And then from asking those questions, we then apply what we refer to as disciplinary tools. Our disciplinary tools are our second dimension. So what are the tools that are specific to civics that apply to this particular topic? What are the aspects of economics that apply? What are the aspects of geography and history that apply? And for my social studies students, future teachers, one of the things I say to them all the time, which comes from this, is if you think geography is not independent of history. And history is not independent of economics. And economics is not independent of political science. So stop teaching social studies compartmentalized. You have to think about all components of it. So if I jump to Dr. Jeffries' example of hard history and teaching slavery, one of the things we'd have said to our teachers are, so slavery, from a geographic perspective, is a study of events in space, right? So it happened somewhere. So it happened through the triangular trade. We start with West Africa, we go to the north, we went to Europe, we come over to the west, we go to the New World, and we can map that out. But it's not just the mapping out, right? It's also a study of events in time. So it's spatial and it's temporal, but it's also a study of economic systems, because without the economic system, we would not have needed the spatial or temporal event. And then it's a study of civic engagement. Why did we get slavery in the first place? Who came up with the idea? Why was it civically inclined for them to say it's okay for us to enslave this particular group of people? And so that's how we view it. And it starts out with one compelling question that's then supported by other questions. We then slide into the notion of sources, because that's a significant problem for social studies, where teachers go to one book and that's it. We wanted to move away from the textbook model to focus more on what are the sources that exist in society that supports your claims. So you're making these claims, you have this information, but where's your source? And it cannot be Wikipedia. I'm sorry. We need good sources. So we now have to teach our teachers how to find appropriate sources that support the claims that they have, and then teach them how to understand those sources, and then teach those sources to their students. So we're not having students who are going out there listening to one news source or one particular article and drawing conclusions. I'll give you an example. In 2016, I had to teach a multiculturalism class. Half my class was Republican, half was Democrat, and I had two libertarians in there. And one of the things I forced my students to do, which to this day, they talk about, is I forced all my CNN, MSNBC students to listen to Fox News. And I forced all my Fox News students to listen to MSNBC. And I said to them, until you listen to the other side, you have no right to oppose what the other side has to say. You cannot oppose the other side without knowledge, source. And so that becomes our third dimension, which is where does your evidence come from? And a fourth dimension is communicating your conclusions and taking informed action. So in other words, you have all this information. It's not to look pretty. This information means something. You're now going to take this information and use it. And I'll give you an example. I happen to have a Muslim student in my class. She walks in and she says, she was really upset at the time. She said that her garbage men were racist. My personality, and I'm Jamaican, by the way, so my Jamaican personality immediately goes like, why would you say that? And she goes, my uncle was putting the trash out, the garbage, he was a little bit late, the garbage truck was there, and the garbage man saw him, he saw the garbage man, the truck was pulling away, and he started chasing the garbage truck, and the garbage truck sped up. And I said to her, let's think about this for a minute, because this is what you're presenting this, you're making a claim, and your evidence is the garbage truck sped up. But let's think about what the garbage man might be thinking about if any man runs after the truck with a garbage bag in hand on any given day. And so it turned into this really deep conversation in class. This is what we're supposed to do. So you're going to take an informed action based on analysis of this particular situation. And so that's what the C3 framework, I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry.
Right, so that's what the C3 framework does. It forces you to go from a question all the way to what do your actions represent as a result of your analysis of that question. We take it a step further and we looked at the various dimensions. So we broke them out. And one of the things I particularly like about the C3 framework is that it's vague enough where a state can simply impose its social studies standards upon it. So for instance, we don't go in K students should know this. In 5th grade, students should know this. We say by the end of 2nd grade, students should know this. So in other words, you have 3 years to gain this knowledge. And then what I've noticed, for instance, I've worked with Michigan's social studies standards writing. And one of the things that we've been able to do is take those general ideas that guide our standards writing and then pull out specific standards that match those content areas. And so the content areas are no longer confined to one grade. So you can't say to a child, if you didn't learn this in kindergarten, then you're behind. Because they literally have several years to gain that knowledge and gain those skills that follow. And I'm going to stop talking there because I could go all day on this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas Brown. I appreciate it. I'm sorry, apparently I froze up a little while there. Thank you for that. That's a very good, thorough covering of sort of what the C3 framework could be for us. And I'm going to hand it last to Ms. Natalie Wexler to talk to us.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm coming at this from a somewhat different angle because I'm not an academic. I'm primarily a journalist, although I do have a background in history. And I'm the author of a book called The Knowledge Gap, which I did most of the research for here in DC. So sorry, muted myself by accident. Okay. I'm going to be drawing partly on the research I did for that book, and I'm going to really be addressing primarily the early elementary grades. But I'd like to start out by pointing out that I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we are in the throes of a social studies crisis in this country. By the way, you may see me looking upwards. That's because I'm consulting my notes that are on the wall behind my computer. It's not that I'm looking to heaven for inspiration. But on national tests, only a quarter of American 8th graders scored proficient or above in civics and US geography, and only 15% in US history. And for students whose parents didn't attend college, the percentages are 10% or less. So let me try to make those statistics more concrete. I've spoken to DC high school teachers, and they've told me that while they have had students at all levels of ability, it's not uncommon to have students who don't know the difference between, say, a city and a state, or a country and a continent, who don't have a grasp of historical chronology, who may confuse the civil rights movement and the Civil War, or believe that slavery lasted into the 20th century. And let me be clear, it's not that these students can't learn these things, it's that they simply haven't been taught these things, or they haven't been taught them early enough. Knowledge building is a gradual, cumulative process, and it really should begin as early as possible. High school students who arrive, who've been denied basic knowledge about the world, who've been denied access to that knowledge, are going to lack the mental framework that will help them understand, say, a textbook in world history, let alone analyze and retain that information. Now, one reason for this situation is that over the past 20 years, social studies has been marginalized or even eliminated from the curriculum in many elementary schools, and often even in middle schools, in a largely vain effort to boost scores on reading and math tests. But a more basic reason when it comes to the early elementary grades is a widespread assumption that topics like history are, quote, developmentally inappropriate, too abstract or remote from their own experience for young children to grasp or be interested in. Now, I want to be clear, there is no evidence to support that idea. To be sure, there are ways of teaching history and factual information or any subject that are developmentally inappropriate. But that's different from a subject itself being inappropriate. You know, history can be presented as a series of stories, and kids love stories. They also actually love acquiring information about the wider world if it's presented in an engaging way. But as a result of this unfounded assumption about developmental inappropriateness, early grades social studies standards generally follow what's called the expanding environments model. So all about me, and then my family, my neighborhood, my community for several years. One reason that social studies gets shunted aside is that educators see these subjects as banal and unimportant. At the same time, early elementary standards are often so vague that they become the kind of abstractions that really are developmentally inappropriate. For example, understanding the concept of time, or that maps are symbolic representations of the world. Now, children can become interested in and absorb these concepts, but really only for the kinds of specifics that early grade standards shy away from because they're deemed inappropriate. So, for example, a standard like American symbols, very common, can lead to a lesson in which students are shown pictures of bald eagles and the flag, but have no context to help make sense of these things. So in one first grade classroom that I visited, students were told the flag stood for independence, but they had learned nothing about the American Revolution or what independence meant. And when one child asked who made the flag, the teacher said, Betsy Ross, and moved on to the next activity without explaining who Betsy Ross was. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not criticizing the teacher. She was only following her training and her instructional materials. Now, I also spent a school year following a second grade classroom that took an atypical approach to early elementary education. The students, who, by the way, were all from low-income families, most of them non-English speaking, were fascinated by historical topics and the geography that went with them. In kindergarten, they'd learned about early America and the colonial era. In first grade, they'd learned about ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, the Maya, Aztec, and Inca civilizations, and the American Revolution, including the legend of Betsy Ross. So by second grade, they were able to engage in rich discussions about subjects like the causes of the War of 1812 and the differences between ancient Greece, China, and India. I wish I could show you videos of these discussions, but I'll give you just a brief example of the kind of thing that went on. One day when the teacher asked, what was something unique, that was one of the vocabulary words for the day, what was something unique about civilizations in ancient Greece? Hands shot up. The boy who was called on confidently answered, something unique was that they weren't near a river and they didn't have any fertile soil. So it was difficult for them to farm. That little boy, by the way, was from a non-English speaking family. These kids not only understood that maps represent the world, they could locate Sparta and Athens on a map of Greece or trace the journey of a fictional family across the United States during westward expansion. That class is not an isolated example. I've seen and heard about the same kind of engagement and sophisticated discussion in other schools that have bucked educational orthodoxy. A Norwegian study found, for example, that preschoolers can become interested in and grasp historical topics, quote, laying the foundation for historical consciousness and its later development at school. The bottom line is that we have vastly underestimated what young children can do. As a result, many are bored and, more important, deprived of access to the kind of knowledge and vocabulary they'll be expected to have in the future. These early years, when children crave information about the world and the past and absorb it readily, are precious. We've wasted them for far too long, and it's time to stop planting the seeds of failure and start planting those of success. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Wexler. Okay, so we've got a couple questions here in the chat, and I'm going to go ahead and start with one of them that is here. One thing we have discussed as an advisory committee is this distinction between standards and curriculum. Our job as the committee is to help recommend principles that guide the state standards. Those state standards will apply to all of the LEAs in DC, so DC public schools, as well as the charter schools. But each of those districts, those LEAs, get to write their own curriculum. There is no state curriculum in DC. So as you think about the power of what can be done with standards versus what might happen with curriculum, can you say a little bit about standards that might drive quality curriculum, given your experiences with standards and curriculum? And I'm happy to start with whomever, but Dr. Allen, it was your comments that prompted this.
Sure, no, I'm happy to jump in on that. So first I want to share that there is a consortium of multiple institutions, I'm going to put this in the chat, that's currently working on a roadmap for educating for American democracy across the grades K through 12. In many ways, the work builds on the C3 framework. The C3 framework is content agnostic, but does a great job of structuring sort of inquiry-based learning. And our roadmap is also very inquiry-driven, but what we have done is started to try to answer the content questions over the 12 grade bands. And so the 7 themes, there are also 5 design challenges, which I will, after I'm done commenting, put in the chat too, because they might be useful to you as you think about your own guiding principles. They're sort of the design principles, guiding principles space is similar. And you know what, in the roadmap work that we're doing, which is funded by the National Endowment for Humanities and Department of Education, there's a real effort to layer, I mean, as Ms. Wexler said, learning over time. So learning is cumulative. So the notions that you have sort of thematic links that cross from all the way from K to 12, and you are getting going in K already, helping young kids think about what civic participation is, thinking about our changing landscape in this country as demography and borders and boundaries interact with each other and shift, as under the We the People theme, how we came to be a people in the first place. What does that even mean to call any group of people a people, and so on. So there's lots to be said there. Reflecting on the experience of Massachusetts, I want to say something about a strength in the Massachusetts standards and a challenge area in the Massachusetts standards. And as I do this, one last thing about these themes, we also have a crosswalk for these themes to all existing state standards. And a lot of what's already in standards is captured by these themes. I think if you take the themes and look at your existing standards, you can see places for strengthening, and then also places where there is already strength. So coming back to Massachusetts, so Massachusetts passed new standards in 2018. At the same time, the state legislature also passed a law requiring that all students do a nonpartisan student-led civic action project by the end of 8th grade and again by the end of high school. So we found ourselves in this interesting moment in Massachusetts where the content standards they're really voluminous. There's a lot of stuff packed in, and you will recognize them. I mean, they're very familiar social studies standards, comparative civilizations, history of religions, the civics standards of the kind that I've been articulating, and so on. But by virtue of having that legislation as well, it has forced the state to actually grapple with this question of how you integrate a content knowledge-oriented education with a form of extra education that's scaffolding participation and agency. And so I think that is a really important thing. It's sort of an accident in Massachusetts that these two things happen together, but I produce a really, really powerful framework, I believe. That's the strength. The challenge area was that in articulating practice standards, the state did articulate the diverse perspectives standard in language similar to what I articulated. But when you looked at any particular year, for example, grade 8, and you look at the texts that were actually showing up in the standards, it was literally the case that every single text of the standards was authored by a proverbial dead white man. And that wasn't necessary. The material covered in the content standards in 8th grade, there's lots of opportunity to fold in voices of people of color, women, and that sort of thing. And so in the curriculum design, we have done that, but in that regard, we feel like we are compensating for a place where the standards were actually internally inconsistent with each other. That is, they established a sort of goal of integrating diverse perspectives, but the actual lists of texts to be read didn't have any of that integration. So I would encourage you, as you articulate your principles, to make sure you're cross-checking with the sort of list of knowledge areas that you're actually recommending. Sort of take the time to make sure that there's coherence across those things. And then, as I said, in my chat comment, I will put the design challenges coming out of this roadmap work into the chat box for you to take away and digest.
Speaking on mute, we have a number of good questions in the chat. I think I'm going to send the next one to to anyone who wants to answer it, actually. Lamar asks, which is more beneficial, teaching students thematically or using a chronological timeline? Would it be effective to incorporate a mix of both? I know, Dr. Jeffries, you've worked with standards before. Dr. Thomas Brown, the C3 framework offers perspective on this. What do you think here?
If I could, I'll jump in on this one. I think the answer is yes, all of the above. It is very, part of it is the way kids learn. At the younger, I would argue, at the younger ages, thematic is often more effective. because they're still wrestling with, when I'm talking about younger ages, I'm talking about kindergarten, first grade, second grade, they're still wrestling with sort of chronology, right? I mean, in terms of time and how long ago. I still think my third grader, is like, oh, you're old, right? That means I'm born 100 years ago. Like, no, I'm not quite that old. Right? So still wrestling with that. But the mix is really what you want, because sometimes it is most effective to teach out of chronology. When I often encourage folk, when they're talking about teaching slavery, for example, I say, they're like, okay, we got to start at the beginning. I was like, well, what's the beginning, right? And I said, in many ways, the best way to teach to get students to understand what slavery was is to get them to try to connect with the enslaved. And the way to do that is to teach resistance and literally lead with resistance, right? Because that's the way that kids will connect with the humanity of those for whom they're not conditioned to connect to. And if they see and understand that they're resisting, then we can then say, oh, okay, then you can recognize their humanity. Oh, I would have done something like that, right? And so once you get that, that's thematic. Then you can sort of build out from there, walk back in time. I'm actually teaching a class this semester on the last 50 years of African American history, and I'm teaching it backwards. And so I literally started with the Republican and Democratic national conventions as they connected to the African American experience, and we're walking backwards in time. Up until 1970, late 1960. So I think the answer is it literally can be a mix of everything. And I think it should be. So students don't, as they're going through their educational experience, don't think that history always happens in a sequential order and that that's the way the world is going to play out, that they should experience it in different ways. And that will build on the strengths of what's going on in different classrooms.
And I want to echo that. I completely agree. You can't say it has to be chronological or thematic. It has to be a mixture of both, because even when you look at the original standards that are out there, they took into consideration the developmental level of the child when you're teaching about chronology and time. So there is some justification, as it were, for teaching some of those topics. My biggest concern is the curriculum components when you write, okay, students should learn about time and chronology and change and that sort of thing, but the teachers don't have the training or the exposure or the right language to find those tangible examples from history, from geography, from civics that will really complement the information. And I think that's where it becomes really, really vague and abstract for kids. And I wrote down that example that Ms. Wexler mentioned about independence. And I'm thinking they're missing skills before they got to the term. So the teacher should have taught some skills before they got there. And that's what the C3 frameworks tries to sort of plug those gaps with those thematic ideas. So I completely agree.
If I could just chime in, I'd actually like to push back a little bit against the idea that themes are more appropriate for younger kids. I mean, they can be, but often what you see in early elementary and elementary social studies textbooks or curricula, to the extent that they're still around, are very broad themes like culture around the world or childhood through the ages. And there are two reasons to focus more on topics rather than themes at that age. One is for kids to absorb and retain information and vocabulary, they need repeated exposures to the same concepts and the same vocabulary. And so it's really a good idea to spend 2 weeks on the same specific topic so they'll get that exposure. Also, you can get these really contextless things, that don't mean very much to kids. It's much more effective if they have a context in which to fit things. So for example, I noticed in the current DC social studies standards, I don't know, I think it's first grade or second grade, but there's a list of biographies. I think the idea is to introduce kids to the concept of biography, and they're just in alphabetical order, just a random collection of people, Joan Baez, the Wright brothers, Albert Einstein. It's going to be much easier for kids to get interested in those biographies if they have some context into which to fit those people. So I would say even at the early grade levels, we should introduce things to at least to some extent by topic and by chronology.
Thank you. I want to jump in and ask Jessica Rucker's question here. One thing the state board prioritized when we said we were interested in rewriting or revising the standards was that we wanted them to be culturally relevant, and include anti-racist standards, anti-racist content, offer the opportunity. What is the most honest, accurate, and effective way to ensure that our standards are really relevant and sustaining and anti-racist? Should they be revised from their current form, or should they be written from scratch?
I mean, I would say that you can get to an anti-racist set of standards from either point. That is, I can understand that some people might say everything that's been done so far has started with the perspective that is exclusionary, and therefore you should sort of scrap it and start from fresh. And I can understand that argument. That said, I think if one is serious and intentional, there's no reason one can't start with something and really sort of push and pull it and turn it inside out, and really ask the question of, like, for each level of it, like, how would this have to look different for it genuinely to meet our aspirations in integrating full diversity of perspectives, in giving voice to hidden narratives, in ensuring that issues of power are brought to the surface for discussion and for intentional engagement. And so, I think it can be very hard for people to start from scratch. So I think actually starting by a process of, going through and reviewing what exists through the lens of the principles that you want is a good starting point. Then you can make the judgment about whether or not the distance you need to travel is sort of so great that you want to just have a clear whiteboard and start fresh, or if you think you can actually restructure from what you have.
But there are so many, I tend to agree, there's so many things pivoted on the standards. You have your teacher certification exams that are related to the standards. You have the students' testings that they do. And while many of us may be opposed to several standardized tests, the tests are also based on that. So I think a process of deep revision in Michigan, what we did was we looked at the C3 framework. We looked at the standards that came from the Southern Poverty Law Center. We pulled up our standards, which coincidentally were rewritten maybe about 15, 20 years ago. And then we used those combinations and we started deep revisions. The final derivative of the standard was significantly different than what we started out with. So it looked almost like a rewrite. But we started out by saying, okay, let's start with grades, kindergarten to third grade. And then we cleaned it up and we went up the line. By the time we got to high school, it was almost a clear rewriting of the standards. So I agree, you will have to probably start out by thinking, let's revise. And then in that process, start seeing whether or not you're going to have to scrap some topics. I think one of the bigger questions for me is, how do you frame the wording of those standards to ensure that teachers can interpret them and apply them in their classroom? It has to be simple, it has to be clear, it has to be applicable. So a teacher should be able to pick that standard up and clearly understand what they're expected to do.
Thank you. I think that also gets a little bit at your question, Mike, where you asked about the C3 standards framework and the use and the rewriting of the standards. Am I freezing again?
I think for those who haven't spotted the question in the chat, if you could maybe read the whole question, that would be helpful.
I'll read the question just on behalf of Jessica, since she is freezing a little bit right now. So this question's from Mike Stevens. Given that DC's latest standards revisions occurred before the creation of C3 and other states have rewritten since its creation, be curious to know, directed at you, Dr. Thomas Brown, if you could speak to their perception of other states' successes, challenges, lessons learned in utilizing the C3 framework.
We started out with a lot of challenges, to be honest. People resisted. Teachers didn't want to change their textbooks. They didn't want to change the topics they were teaching. They had those old materials, that sort of thing. So it was challenging. Our state put a lot of money into training teachers just to be aware of the C3 framework before they started rewriting the standards to match the C3 framework. So several persons came in various districts, did training, teaching teachers how to use the framework. One of the big buy-ins we got was College of Education, social studies professors being willing to use the C3 framework in their social studies methods classes to expose teachers to, or future teachers to, how to plan lessons. And so it was a combination of training right across the board. And then that started, I want to say 2013, all the way to about 2015 to 2016. And then we started our rewriting after that. So it was some time after we exposed people to the framework of the C3 and what we were about, that we started saying, okay, now we started rewriting it. Now we started looking at what we revised. And it was very piecemeal. To be honest, I think last year we just finished revising our standards. It took us a good 5 years doing it piecemeal to get to where we are. And it seems to be working so far. It seems to be working.
Great. Thank you for pinch hitting there, Alex. I moved a little closer to my router. I imagine I'm having the same problem many of your students are having with a slightly overloaded internet right now. We'd love to ask one last question of the panelists, as I know that we asked folks to be here till 6. There are obviously quite a few other questions in our chat. So if our panelists are open to it, we'd love to follow up with you on questions we didn't get to tonight and ask you to send back any thoughts you've got. But for our last question with you all together tonight, we're in the process of this standards reconsideration in DC. You all have experience with having watched social studies, helped write standards, developed curricula. What one piece of advice would you give to this advisory group, which is charged with creating the principles that will guide our standards writing going forward? What should we know? What would you share for us? We'll go with Dr. Allen first, since I know you have a hard stop.
Thank you. Don't underestimate the importance of investing in professional development for educators. As you adjust the standards, they have to learn new things. And that's not a small ask. And so as you imagine shifting the standards, what you have to recognize is that what you're shifting is a whole community of practice and what they know and how they think about prioritizing what they know. So the standards are just a kind of small lever. It's really the community of practice. Really think from the beginning about professional development.
Thank you. We'll come next to Dr. Jeffries.
Thank you. And I would second that you can't underestimate the teachers. And I also think, and this builds on what Ms. Wexler had pointed out earlier, don't underestimate the students, the kids at all ages, and their ability not only to learn, but their ability to wrap their minds around those aspects that are most difficult for even us to talk about, to learn about in public and in polite company. Do not underestimate them. And that includes some of the hardest subjects, all done age appropriate, but we do ourselves a disservice when we hold back thinking that kids either are incapable or it's not necessary for them to learn these difficult subjects at the earliest ages. And it sets them up, when we do give them this information early, it sets them up to be better students, better thinkers, and better people, better citizens as they age and move through their educational experience and then through life.
Dr. Thomas Brown?
As you're thinking about the standards, and I agree with Dr. Allen, you're thinking about changing a community of practice. But at the same time, let's not make the mistakes that we have made in previous standards writing, where teachers pick the standards up and have no clue what to do with them. So I subscribe to the idea of fewer, higher, clearer. You don't need a million standards. You need good quality, you need it clear, and you need it applicable in your classroom. And you need to ensure that it's integrated, and integrated disciplinary wise, but also integrated in terms of informing the action students take when they leave school. So ensure that you put examples of resources that teachers can access, so we can get that anti-racist pedagogy in there. We can get those themes and those topics in there as well. So it's full and rich.
Thank you. Ms. Wexler?
Well, aside from my point about specificity at lower grade levels and not shying away from history at lower grade levels, I'd like to say something that I think is in tension with that specificity point, which is, it has been said, standards are not curriculum. Curriculum is going to be needed to implement these standards. And I feel it is not a great idea for teachers to try to write their own curriculum. That is a very heavy lift for teachers. They're not necessarily trained to write their own curriculum. They should be devoting their energies to implementing curriculum. So when you craft standards, I think you might want to keep an eye to what high quality curriculum is out there, especially in the early grade levels, and maybe try to find some things that are common to those high quality curricula that do introduce real topics at the early grade levels, including historical topics, so that teachers are not in a position of having to try to fit a curriculum to standards that don't match up, and then having to perhaps on the fly create their own curriculum to match the standards that the curriculum doesn't line up with.
Great. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We appreciate your time. We appreciate you sharing your expertise and your perspective on how we're approaching our work here, writing the social studies guiding principles. We'll send you the additional questions that we didn't get to tonight, and we so appreciate your willingness to continue to engage with us. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your bold ambition. It's great to hear. Good luck.
Absolutely. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for letting us jump right in there, because we did have hard stops at 6. We didn't get to do much of a sort of broader introduction. And then my internet decided to be funky. So thanks for bearing with me on all the things tonight. I'm going to pull up our presentation for tonight so that we can all have a shared agenda in front of us. I hope that you did have a chance to take a look at it before the presentation, at least just to get a sense of who the folks we invited to participate were, and about sort of what we had in mind for hearing from them. We'll start from here. Okay. So we're gonna spend the rest of our meeting really focused on 2 things, and we're gonna stay all together in the large group for both of these, because it's a little bit of me information sharing and then hearing back your reflections and reactions to it. Our October meeting is really going to be like a nitty gritty working through the last draft of the guiding principles before we bring it out to the public. So tonight is really some level setting on both where are we with those principles and where are we with how we're engaging the public, so that we can be ready to really jump in October. It means a lot of hearing from me, but I hope it also is a little bit of a lighter lift, given some of you are in your 2nd week of teaching. Congratulations. Some of you are in your 2nd week of homeschooling or facilitating virtual learning with your own children. Congratulations. So let me carry the weight tonight and just tell me what you think about what we've got here. So we did our first already. We heard from a panel of experts, and I'd actually love to hear some thoughts on that in just a moment. We are going to talk about the latest contributions to the guiding principles draft, and then we're going to talk about community engagement during the month of October. Everybody, we have a couple of folks who weren't here with us tonight. They're going to watch the recording and let us know what questions and comments they had afterwards. Our norms remain the same. I thank you all for the great questions you had for our advisors. Certainly lots of divergent thinking in there, as well as building energy and asking questions to learn more. We heard from our excellent experts. Before we go back into the guiding principles we've got. Any thoughts, reactions to the panelists, comments, questions that are still front of mind for you that you want to make sure we don't lose? You'll look for both hand raising in the participants and also anyone who's got a hand up in the screen. Molly?
It's just something I'm like continuing to grapple with. And I dropped the Michigan standards in because I feel like they might help me clarify this. And I don't know if they'll help clarify others, but I'm thinking a lot about how we take what feels to me like curriculum and pedagogy frameworks and like infuse those into the standards to help drive choices that LEAs and schools are going to make. And like, what is the balance there? Because it feels weird to say everyone's going to do project-based learning and everyone's going to do a curriculum or pedagogy practice, which like the schools may not adopt. So I'm just kind of wrestling with that in my mind right now.
Yeah, that's on my mind as well, given that Dr. Allen shared that this project-based learning was so much at the crux of the way they're thinking about the civic engagement learning they're doing. Lizzie.
So mine actually builds nicely on Molly's. So I've been thinking a lot about this, and apologies, I've not done probably due diligence in looking at a lot of the model standards, but how do we bring the social and emotional learning into that? So we heard that from Danielle and Dr. Jeffries, but what does that look like when so much of that takes place in actual pedagogy, in project-based learning? So that's a big question I've had that I'm grappling with.
Any other thoughts, things that are still circling for folks? Okay. I will make sure that we get the other questions that were in the chat and we send those on to the panelists, and we'll share back with everyone any responses we get to any of the questions that folks had there, because we touched on a number of them, but we definitely didn't get through everybody's. All right, let's go back to the sharing for a second. So thank you to those of you who had the chance to chime in on the guiding principles document that Alex shared last week. It was a Google Doc, and one key thing that was different about the document last week was that in a meeting with OSSE following this last advisory committee meeting, OSSE offered up a list of questions that are of interest to them to have answers to as they begin to convene their technical writing committee. As I'm sure a number of you saw today, announced in the news that the superintendent of OSSE is leaving her role in October. We don't have word from the mayor's office yet on who will be the new leader of the agency, but to the best of our understanding, the social studies work is still continuing, and the agency has committed to it. And I certainly hope that whoever Superintendent Kang's, why am I not thinking of the right word? It's not predecessor, it's the person who follows her, can't think of the right word there, successor, there we go, will in fact continue this work. But these questions that OSSE provided us are what they think they need to give to a technical writing committee. So a number of you chimed in on those questions, but there are a few that are still unanswered. And then there are other questions in the document that are sort of oversubscribed, if you will, where we've got a lot of thinking on some of those questions, and it'll probably lead us to more than 15 or 20 principles in total. So when I looked at the document, and I'll make sure we can I have Alex or someone else in the staff just drop the link into the chat for me while I'm sharing this for that guiding principles document. There are too many currently. That's where we stand. We've got lots of good thinking. It's still very much thinking in process, but there are way more than 15 or 20. Some of the questions OSSE asked us have few or no guiding principles listed. Thank you so much for getting that in the chat. These are 3 that have no or few responses. What are the strengths of the current standards? Maybe it's that we don't think there are any, but I think we probably need to discuss and decide that if that's where we're starting from. Are there specific events and facts that all students should know by the time they graduate? I think it's a really interesting question. It's also one that now is circling for me, having listened to Dr. Thomas Brown note that we want standards to be fewer, higher, clearer. but also listening to Ms. Wexler say we need specificity. I'm not sure how we balance that in a question like that, but I think it's something we've got to wrestle with. And then from our standards, how do we want students to be able to engage with diversity and different perspectives? And I think some of that goes to Dr. Allen's thinking around what is it to be sort of knowledge literate? How are we making sense of information? How are we taking a look at different perspectives? That's certainly something that comes up in the C3 framework as well. So we've got places where we've got too much. We've got other places where we have not enough. We also want to think about how the guiding principles will connect to other learning standards. I know this is an area of friction whenever this comes up between social studies and ELA, because there's a real concern, I think it's a valid one, that we don't let social studies get subsumed into ELA. On the other hand, I do think there's a real benefit to having connectivity that allows standards to reinforce and build on one another. So I think there's some questions here that we might want to think about, because right now we don't have any thinking or very much thinking at all on these two questions OSSE asked. Are there ELA expectations that should be restated in the social studies standards? Are there skills of writing, thinking, knowledge literacy that should be enforced and reinforced in the social studies standards? And then how do we make sure that we're working literacy instruction into the social studies standards? Where is it appropriate to do that? Whether it's nonfiction reading skills, whether it's particular forms of writing and speaking, how do we think about that? And then we have to actually move ourselves towards decisions about which guiding principles we're going to ask the public to review, because we want to make sure that what we put out to the public is in language that we agree on and are comfortable with, but that we understand will still require adjustment after we get public feedback before we give it to the state board for voting and adoption. So that's where I think we stand with the guiding principles. I'll come here for a second to what I'm going to ask folks to do, and then I'm going to stop sharing screen so we can look at each other and talk through this a little bit. What I'm hoping you'll do by the end of this month is read the current draft list of the guiding principles. That's the hyperlink that's in the chat. I'll drop in some additional questions and prompts, specifically the ones I just mentioned, like we have nothing or very little here. How does this work together? I'm going to ask you also to add in additional comments or edits that you have to the existing draft principles. Again, Alex had sent out the list a week ago. I know it was a pretty short time frame that we asked folks to use. So I saw 6 or 7 people who had put comments in, and I want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to take a real look at these and add in any edits or comments they have. And then finally, I'd like to ask that by the end of this month, you start to make yourself a top 10 list. What are 10 things that are critical for you to be included in the guiding principles that we send to the public, that we ask the state board to adopt, that we give to OSSE's writing committee? What are the 10 things that are most important to you? They need not be the written words in the current guiding principles document, because we're going to do some editing and refining together next month. But what are the 10 things that are sort of your non-negotiables? You want to make sure that these things are hit in the guiding principles. Ideally, if they don't exist in there now, you're going to add them in when you put your comments and edits in. But what are your top 10? Because I want to make sure that all of the thoughts that you all have are represented in the document as we start to make decisions. And I want to be able to know that each of you got something that was critical and important to you into this final document. So I can't guarantee that you're going to love all 20 of them, or they're going to be the 20 you would have chosen. But if you've got your top 10, I'd love to make sure that we're getting a few of each of your gotta have it's into our final document. Okay, so I'll bring this slide back in a second. It looks like we have at least one process question, maybe another question. So I want to give some time for that. Laura, let's start with you.
So I think I am officially confused as to where we're at and where we're going and what we're doing. It feels all of a sudden very fast. I'm not sure. Maybe I missed something. I've been, work has been distracting. So I guess here's a thought that I had. on kind of the process? Like, or I guess I'm wondering if this is what's happening and I just missed it, or I'm just missing the big picture. Like, are we potentially breaking into like committees in some of these sections with like the bullet points to work on refining, collecting, making, you know, all these bullet points into statements that try to capture as much as we can to then get more specific feedback before we're going to the public? Is it that we're all commenting on everything ourselves? And then, I guess, or is it like that we're just adding a bunch of stuff and then the staff is going to try to aggregate it and give us language to then comment on more specifically? I guess I'm just really kind of lost. And then, like, how many more meetings before we're trying to take it to the public? Like, do we have a really quick turnaround and we need to get it done now? Is it that we have a couple more meetings where we're working on this? I guess I just, somehow I got lost.
Yeah, no, I mean, these are all fair questions, and I'll preface it with, we're balancing a lot of competing priorities. So we started meeting in July. We said we would take this to the state board for a vote by December. So we had July, August, September, October, November to get everything ready for a final meeting of this advisory committee in December to prepare to send this off to OSSE. So that gives us 5 working meetings. The first was an intro. The second was a process. This is the third. And one thing that was important to members of the group is that we heard from experts. So we had to dedicate a portion of that time to this. We also, I in prior opportunities to ask folks how they wanted to engage, asked a little bit about committees and subgroups. There wasn't a huge appetite for work between the meetings. So we're working with the meetings that we've got. And this was, I think I try to make that clear to folks. We've also talked about the number of meetings we have from the beginning. So I apologize if I was less than clear on any of that.
I guess I meant committees meeting like now, like that I'd be like, I'm on the diversity committee, kind of like we did on ESSA, you know, like instead of it just being a breakout group where we go over all of them, I'm like, well, I want to go into this breakout group. And someone was like, I want to go into that breakout group, just to have, like, people could still comment on everything, but that like they could do that deep dive, try to aggregate and come up with specific language that we're then commenting on. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, Laura, I'm certainly happy to consider how that be one of the ways we deal with them next month before we put them out to the public. But I don't think, my take on the current state of the guiding principles is that they're not there yet. There are still places where we have very little language. I think too, I'm not sure how to break folks up. We talked about grade level versus content strand, but it appears that we want both vertical alignment here across the grade level. So breaking into grade levels is fine for a part, but not something people want to spend all their time in. As we think about integrating the content across the grade, making sure that, for instance, maybe we don't keep social studies grade 6 as just a geography course. Breaking into the content areas becomes the same kind of thing, like jigsawing might work, but again, we've got some time constraints. So where we are now is that this meeting was a chance to hear from the experts and to share sort of where we are, and then to ask folks to do the in-between work as individuals, to put more stuff into the document. And next month's meeting is all diving into that document for 2 hours in different groups. And it sounds like there's at least some appetite to break into subgroups to do that work more specifically, rather than everybody breaking into a group and looking at the whole document, having folks pick a section of the guiding principles document that they'd like to focus on. Looks like I'm seeing some nods. So if that feels right to folks, I'll add that to our work before next month. We'll ask folks, which of these sections do you want to dig deep on in our October meeting, so that I can group folks that way ahead of time. Okay, I'm seeing lots of nods. So I appreciate that, Laura. I think that's a really good suggestion. Other questions on process, where we are, what we're doing? Lizzie, is your hand up? Okay. Sally.
Hi there. So maybe I'm a little, I'm not confused, I don't think, but it seems to me, looking at this guiding principles document, there are a lot of bulleted points. I'm reading the latest version, right, with a lot of bulleted information. And some of these guiding principles seem to be instructions to OSSE as they go about the work of writing the standards. Some of these, I think, belong or could belong at the front of the standards document when it finally gets published. That is our view of the purpose of social studies, the big principles that guide the writing of the social studies. And I think these are two different kinds of guiding principles. And to me, while OSSE, I know, is asking very specific questions like, should we revise, replace? That's not really that important to the public, I don't think. I think what's important is what we want our students to learn, not specific details, but what is the point of social studies? And that gets at some of the big issues that we've been talking about. So I don't want the big issues to get lost in the voluminous amount of guidelines that we have here. I think it's really important for this committee, at least this is what I had envisioned, that we were going to rethink what we're trying to accomplish with our social studies standards. I personally had major issues with those guiding philosophies at the front of the social studies standards that we are looking at from last time. I mean, you can see they're very outdated, to be generous. So to me, I'm kind of grappling with those sort of two levels of the guiding, whatever it's called, guiding principles that we're developing. So, and again, I feel like, Laura, that it just seems really quick now, all of a sudden, that we have a lot of work to do. So anyway, that's my comments.
I sincerely apologize, truthfully, if I misled folks into the amount of work we had to do and the time period we had to do it. I tried each month to make sure we were clear on sort of how many months we had left. But I do think, Sally, your point is a good one, and I want to hear what others think on this. I think my personal take is that the guiding principles need to be a mix of both. They need to be a mix of explicit instruction to OSSE on what is in and what we think should be in and out on these standards for this state, as well as a set of some philosophical notions about what social studies is for and what it should include and how it thus should be organized. But I don't see a tension between including both of those things. I could be alone in that.
I think, Jessica, the question for me, is coming up as I think about having to make a top 10 list, so that it may be, and I'm going to confess that I have not spent time in this document yet. So I'm one of the people that didn't do the assignment and apologize for that. But I can imagine that there are going to be some things that are much more on the philosophy that I would want to see treated by them and what we call front matter. And yet I'm not going to want to necessarily give up my vote on some things, some topics that are, or some principles that are specific to, topics itself. Again, I don't know, until I've really gotten in there more, but my guess is it's it feels a little bit like we're operating at two different levels, and we're asking people to, and maybe that's okay that, sort of people weigh in where they want to be, but it could be that that's some of the tension folks are feeling.
So say more about that, Barbara. What levels are we working at that seem different to you?
Well, I'm just going to swag it here. That I might have some a fair bit to say about what the content is, and including the elevation of that content. I mean, I've kind of got this notion that the way that we get to fewer, higher, clearer is to think a little bit about major work of the grade, as you know, as was done with the math standards, for example. So that seems to me to be sort of the content that's going to be driving statements about and guiding it would result in some guiding principles about how to think about the content. And yet it seems that there's also this issue of, you know, our belief. I'm just going to sort of throw one out there because it's one I continue to be interested in, that we are never going to be able to get to where we want to get to have kids in middle school and beyond that are really actively engaged in civic, or, you know, in civic participation if they don't have, you know, a pretty solid foundation in some history, for example, and all that history, you know, that Dr. Jeffries was talking about. And so that seems to me to be more maybe on the driving sort of philosophical level.
So one thing, I mean, Jennifer, you pose a good question in the chat. Is it possible to provide a set of philosophical guiding principles and a separate set of technical guiding principles? I think that's not a bad question. And I think I could see the answer to that being yes. We could certainly say to OSSE, here's what we think standards should be philosophically. Here's the content guiding principles we want. I think that's a fine sort of compromise. One point that I'll note, though, is I still don't know how we would get to that with a manageable set of number of principles if I don't ask each of you to tell me which 10 matter most to you. So if you want to split that 10, 5 philosophical, 5 content, okay. But my concern is this. I could talk for hours and days about what I think the standards should be and do and want in them. But we do have to give the technical committee something concrete to work with. And I think we have a responsibility to make it manageable. So I still will be put in the difficult position of asking you all to narrow your thinking, right? We talked about this in our first meeting. We've got hundreds of ideas that we've got to funnel down and distill into something manageable to ask folks to write to. So I don't have any problem with splitting 2 sections so that maybe we end up with 5 that are philosophical and 15 that are deeply focused on content. I struggle if we get north of that number of 20 to wonder whether we've given writers anything manageable to work with. Other thoughts from folks? I feel like I'm hearing from some of the same folks I've heard from the last meeting. So I don't want to pressure folks into speaking, but I am concerned for folks who've been more quiet. What's on your mind?
While I appreciate the kind of efficiency of breaking into committees, I do worry about gaps that could potentially emerge in this work as one committee focuses on philosophy. And I do worry a little bit about this, about us kind of getting out of step with each other. And because I have no mind for logistics, I don't have a way to solve that, but it is a concern I have.
Sarah, this is John Paul. I had a lot of trouble hearing you. Can you just repeat what you just said?
Sorry, everyone, but yeah. When we break into committees, I worry that and if we talk about something more high level and abstract like philosophy, and then something that might drill down into content more, I worry about us falling out of step with each other. We are all really passionate people. We have strong opinions around this work, and I think it's important to not deliver a document that might at times seem that there might be openings for any confusion in terms of how OSSE receives it.
The other thing I'll add to Sarah's point there, and I think it's a reasonable concern, is we're putting these out for public comment. And when we get to our next section, we talk about community engagement and the various groups in the public we want to engage and how we want to engage them and what we want to ask them to comment on. I'm quite moved by Dr. Thomas Brown's encouragement to make sure that we put things in plain speech, that we put things in a way that we're not asking parents to engage with a document that reads like jargon to them, that we don't ask students to engage with a document that may go over their head if it's a grade level content they haven't learned yet, and that we don't ask folks for whom English is not their first language to engage in complex, nuanced topics that even in translation may get lost if they are subject specific and folks are engaging in something outside their subject matter expertise. So as we think about these guiding principles, I also hope that we're thinking about them as plain text enough to be understood by the citizens we're asking to engage with them. Any other thoughts on this tension in guiding principles between philosophy and content? I'll offer one last reminder. This isn't the only bite at the apple on this. So we're going to put together a document to send to the public. We're going to get back the public's input, have another chance to revise and iterate in November. We'll put it to the board. The board may have comments, may have questions. We can either, if we need more time, can come back at it in our December meeting and ask the board to vote on it in December. For you all, I'm not sure if this rhythm is clear. The state board has its working session, then we have our advisory committee, then we have a board social studies committee, then we have a public meeting when the board votes. So if we needed to continue to work with this document in December, we could do that and still have the state board vote on it in December. So we do have that time. And then as the writing committee engages, we talked with OSSE about making sure there's a clear feedback loop between the advisory committee and the writing committee. And there's a chance to engage with the writing committee on whether or not you're seeing what you want from them in your principles reflected in what they're writing. This is, of course, the messiest part of the process and thus the one that makes me want to put my head in my hands, but it's also the important part of the work. All right, I won't belabor it, but if folks have more thoughts, please put it in the chat. Please chime in because I don't want to hear from just a few of you. So let's come back for a second and talk then. We'll go back to these tasks again before the end of the meeting, but let's talk about community engagement. So thank you to all of you who filled out your ideas on how we can engage the community in this very strange time. We got 20 responses to the survey, so that's most of you, and I really appreciate the thought you put into how we should do this. So as we thought about ways to have COVID-safe engagement, IRL here stands for in real life. So there were thoughts about flyers or surveys to be distributed at food sites. So whether that's the school meal sites or grocery distribution sites, working with mutual aid groups. In Ward 6 mutual aid seems to be everywhere all the time. So I know they would be happy to engage with us. Thinking about other opportunities for folks to sign up for time slots so that we could have socially distant opportunities for folks to provide real life feedback, or outside early voting polling places, right? We have early voting in the district. Folks have a couple weeks to go in person. As long as we stand outside the zone, there's no prohibition about us asking about people's interest in social studies while they're coming to do their civic duty. There were lots of good suggestions on other forms of outreach, and there are a couple things that I just want to bring up. Phone banking seems like such a great idea. We don't have a ready-made bank of phone numbers. So I think I'd want to encourage folks that if that's something we think we should do it in conjunction with some of the other things you all suggested. Maybe ANC commissioners would be willing to offer phone lists for their constituents or to help us make phone calls. If you're part of a civic association, a few of you noted the ward you live in and the connections you have there. Maybe your civic association has a phone list and you could call folks there. But we at the state board do not have a comprehensive database of phone numbers that we can use to call folks. And given COVID and other budget cuts, we don't have a budget to hire sort of a polling firm to do this. That cost prohibition is the same thing on the mailing paper surveys and sort of a newspaper ad. But I do think that some of the local newspapers would absolutely put in notice for us, either about some of these in real life engagement opportunities or a link to a survey. We can put in like a bit.ly. So I think those are all good ideas. We're talking with our comms folks at the state board about ways to get this on radio or TV. Rather than purchasing ad time, for instance, we could probably get some news folks to let us highlight this as an important community news story so that it does reach folks in their homes on the networks at night. I'm going to ask all of my board colleagues to go out to their ANC meetings during the month of October to engage with their ANCs, whether that be bringing paper surveys or asking the ANC to help spread the word to their single member districts. I think that's going to be a great way to get down to folks who might not ordinarily respond to us. And then I love this plan, and I certainly hope that those of you who suggested it would also be willing to implement it. Working with folks who are educators on the SISEC and folks who are students to engage their school communities for feedback. So whether that's asking your students as part of a class session or giving them a bit.ly to fill out a survey, asking your colleagues to engage in this way and to help us get this feedback back. So these were the great ideas that you all had. These are the constituencies you wanted to prioritize: families, students, teachers, schools. The first two, I think, bring me back to this question of making sure things are in as plain language as possible so that we make sure we're reaching folks who are not thinking about social studies all day, every day. Using the folks in schools who do think about social studies all day, every day to help us get some really strong feedback on the standards themselves. Reaching out to museums, think tanks, universities, and other cultural organizations. And then two priority groups that I thought were really important that folks called out, making sure we reach out to immigrant communities. So we're thinking about language access and translation, but making sure that we are reaching folks in DC's immigrant communities, and that we're working with youth activists and other youth serving organizations, those who work with young people every day, especially in a civic capacity. And then these were specific groups that came up. So Teaching for Change and the DC social justice educators within that organization came up quite a few times, as did the National Council for the Social Studies in Education Project and the other groups listed here. And then there were 23 other individual suggestions that folks had specific names of professors, et cetera, for us to reach out to. We also, I think there was a person who made this suggestion, and we wholeheartedly agree. We're going to reach out to everyone who applied for the SISAC but was not chosen for it, because we know they're highly engaged in the social studies, in the standards. They have a deep interest in this, and we want to make sure that we give them a chance to deeply engage with the standards as well. So given these ideas about how to engage, given these groups with whom to engage, and given the priority folks you want us to engage with, we're going to attempt to create a little bit of sort of a jigsaw puzzle of scheduling on what are the opportunities, how would we staff them and roll them out, who would want to participate in them, how would you want to participate in them, so that we can start to fill in all the blanks. How many of you will engage your classes? How many of you will engage your colleagues? How many of you would be willing to be in real life? What ward do you want to do that in? How do we match that all up? And that's going to be on me and the staff, that we're actually going to put together this list of options and ask you all between now and October to sort of fill in some slots on what you'll take charge of, so that we can begin to delegate, so that we can ask you, great, if you're going to do that, here's how we're going to do that, and make sure that we have things presented in a way that is able to be processed for those groups in those places. I'm just having all the technology issues today. My battery is draining rapidly, so I'm going back to the plug over here. I'm seeing a lot of comments come up in the chat. John Paul, can you take for a second and tell me what Daniel's great question was that we should deal with?
Yeah, absolutely. So Daniel was talking about that he noticed in the first section, that there was some really good information related to some of the neglected topics, but that the list, he says, the current list only narrowly addresses all the content that we might want students to learn across the K-12 grades, and he worries that it might be a little confusing to the public when we present the document to them. And I think one of the points that I wanted to specifically highlight about that for me is that one of the points that was made earlier, we're not going to be able to get everything into the standards, right? And I think Barbara made this point earlier about, Barbara, and you'll forgive me the three words that you used, but the fewer, clearer.
Higher is the other one.
Thank you. Fewer, clearer, higher related to standards. And I think it's important in both points to note, like, and this is the challenge that we're getting to, is the standards versus curriculum pieces, right? And making sure that our teachers have the flexibility and the training that they need in order to be able to do all of the things that we know that our students need. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Danielle, do you have other thoughts on that as you're thinking about how we correct this as we work towards a final document?
I don't have any thoughts really in terms of how we correct it. It's just to the point that Paul or John made. I think it would be really confusing if we just present the current document to the public, because it would seem like this is the only content that we're interested in covering. And when I went through and made comments, there's a lot of content I don't have any problems with that I didn't mention at all, that I actually do think is important that students learn. But I just didn't make any mention of. But that somebody who's not familiar with kind of what we've been doing might say, like, why didn't you cover that? And so I don't really know how to address it, save rewriting the entire standards into this and commenting on every single standard and what should be included and what should be dropped. But I think some kind of happy medium there, I think, is important so that people recognize kind of what we are recommending in terms of coverage.
So Danielle, are you when you say the current document, you're talking about the document, the guiding principles document, the Google Doc that we're working from, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, it's just, I'm sort of having this observation that, and I realize that I probably come at this with a little more standards writing experience. As I said, I'm not the one that does it, but I've certainly been around a number of these processes. And it is always, I mean, generally the role of those who are not doing the writing is to point out what's missing and what you don't like, you know, and it probably is important. And so we're kind of in that role, and certainly it's going to be the role, it's going to be what we're going to get from the public and, you know, and all of that. So maybe what Danielle has sort of highlighted for us. And again, I mean, it's certainly something that I would be looking at when I go back in, and maybe Jessica, it's what you're asking us all to do, is at least that there should be something, maybe one of our 10 guiding principles is to provide, or at least as we give you drafts of what those would be, you know, something about what's currently there, at least to have some opinion about, to have some statement about what we do with what's currently there. Because it seems like what Danielle's saying, and I couldn't agree more, you know, this isn't really a coherent picture yet, just to sort of have a laundry list of things that we don't, you know, that we don't like. We've got to start to talk about, and whether we start from scratch or they start from scratch, or start from the current draft, at least they need some guidance about about what's there, you know, notionally anyway, is where we want them to start or to be thinking about. So that's, I think, incumbent on all of us, is all that I'm saying, Jessica. It seems to me, and what Danielle is saying is to when we go in and provide you with our comments, to have some opinion about that.
Karen, can I ask you to share a little bit more about your good comment there? I know you put it in the chat, but I'm going to ask you to expound on it.
Yeah, I was like, that's not going to cut it. She's not going to let me get away with just that comment. I was just looking at the C3 framework as a way to try to wrap my brain around maybe some of the work we're trying to do. And there's a clear sort of 4-dimension framework that is used, and then it gets more specific. So then if I go back to our document, we have some big bucket items, but then the material that we're placing under those big bucket items are kind of all over the place. So I'm wondering if we just structure the document a little differently. So we were talking about sort of a set of philosophical notions as well as like explicit instructions. So I wonder if it's saying like in diversity and inclusion, these are the philosophical things that we want OSSE to consider. These are the explicit instructions. And then a third bucket item of like, these are the things we know about the current standards that we either want to change or keep, knowing that that list will never be fully comprehensive, but allows us as people who are in the weeds with the standards to say, well, that is reflective in the document here. My point was made here. But then backing up to say, these are the philosophical things we need to consider under that big bucket item. And then these are the explicit instructions that we're giving.
Yeah, so when I look back, when I look at the document, the guiding principles document, you've got the what are the strengths of the existing standards that we may want to preserve in the newer version of the social studies standards? And we don't really have much there. So maybe something we say, to your point, Karen, is that if each section is organized by what we advocate keeping, what we think is philosophically important to do here, explicitly what we want to change about this. So that there's a statement of what is and what we like, what we're aspirationally hoping for, and then explicitly our critiques and gripes, to Barbara's point, like that which we want done differently.
And I think that explicit what we want done differently could be connected back to specific standards. Like this is an example of how we don't want it to happen.
And this goes back to the example, counterexample thing that we talked about 2 meetings ago. Okay. I think a reorganization of the document, Daniel, does that help? Do you think give folks maybe a little context for a thing we like or a thing that is there currently? I agree with you. It won't give everybody everything, but I wonder if we have at least online, perhaps in person, a copy of the standards. And then this document that at least gives folks a primer on, we like this, here's what we're hoping for, here's what we specifically want different.
Yes, I think that's a good approach to take.
Okay, so we can make that change to the document so that helps organize it a little bit differently. Thank you for that.
Are we, Jessica, creating an awfully tall order by asking ourselves to have a document that both goes to the OSSE team writing and that's a public facing document for input? And that just feels to me like, I guess I'm not sure I completely understand. I feel like I sort of missed something about this need to share a guiding principles document broadly with the public.
Let me just interject for a second, Barbara, because I think there are lots of different ways we could do it. We could just say to the public, what do you know about the social studies standards? What do you like about them? What do you want to be different? I'll be very straightforward. I feel like my role in this process as the co-chair is to help organize a process that meets a lot of different people's needs, wants, and interests. A common gripe in Washington, D.C. is that the public didn't know what was happening, wasn't actively engaged, didn't know what was really being discussed. So I am erring on the side of, I want to give folks what we're working on. I don't want anyone to say we hid the ball. I don't want anyone to say we didn't put it out in the open. If the group disagrees and you all think there's a better way to do this, I would be very happy to be corrected, to say the guiding principles are really for OSSE. They are for the board. They are not for the public. And this is this other way we want to ask the public.
I'm just going to put my vote in, or just to maybe I haven't thought about it enough, but just to sort of be a little provocative and put it out there. I absolutely think that the public should be provided the information, and they're going to have lots of opportunity to comment on the process and the product. I'm just wondering whether or not, given how hard an exercise this is for people that have been participating, you know, and will have more by the time it's all said and done. I mean, I was a part, came in, public engagement in this process is absolutely critical, but it's thinking about how it is done is worth thinking really hard about. And I just wonder if this is the point at which, you know, that's best sought through this, you know, very robust plan that's being put on the table. Is it at this level? Is it at this time? I think it should be shared. So I guess I'm going to put a vote in, you know, just for purposes of conversation, for sharing what those guiding principles are, but asking for input and then trying to adjust a document that's been really, you know, hard enough to put together, and then having to sort of upend it with you know, to accommodate the input of people that not, you know, a community that hasn't had it as their job for the last 6 months to sort of focus on it. That might be a little bit hard.
But Dal, I'm going to call on you for a second, because you made a really good point about parent groups as a place to solicit feedback. Do you have a thought on like what would we offer to those PTOs in an ideal situation? Would we offer them our guiding principles doc? Would we offer them some other questionnaire?
That's a good question. To be honest, I'm not completely sure. Part of me, so here's what I'm balancing. Part of me wonders, right, is it important for them to make sure they're giving feedback that's like works within the guidelines of what we're creating? But the other part of me wonders, like, would it make more sense for like the first round of feedback to not be anything that's been primed by anything? Like, do we want to just see what people are thinking about social studies standards and history standards in general, and what they've seen based on what they've seen in their classrooms of their students? So I'm not sure which side, because I do think we do need to balance both of those things. So yeah, but I do think that's what we should be considering.
Thank you. Alex O'Sullivan, I'm going to call on you because you put a comment in the chat, and then I'm going to come to you, Jessica.
Well, what I said in the chat was, what if we went to schools and asked students and teachers, because it's easier now since everything's virtual, probably to just go on Teams or something, or put together some like event after school to sort of like ask students, make it interactive, ask students and maybe teachers too about what they've thought about social studies, and then giving them like a sample like guiding principle or something, and saying like, how does this sound, or do you think this is like strongly worded enough or something? I just think it would be helpful if we use the resources we have now, because it may be more difficult in the future to go directly to schools.
Yep. Jessica?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm really, I want to be considerate of how I frame this, and I'm open to feedback and perspectives. But in the skin that I'm in, as somebody born here, multi-generational, graduated from the public schools here, I vote here, I teach here, I work here, I have siblings who are still in the public schools here, a mom who's very actively engaged. One of the concerns, and I could be mishearing, is that one of my concerns is that it sounds like we almost want, time is a factor, resources are a factor. Getting input is tough. Like, the more people who are invited to carry the water, the more strategic we need to be. What is giving me pause though is I don't want to participate in something that's like, hey, we want the community's feedback once it's already kind of like done. And as a Washingtonian, that like, and it frustrates me more than anything, because what it is like, well, we know what's good for you. Just go ahead and give this a head nod and we're going to slam dunk it, instead of saying like, this might take a few more extra steps to really get the feedback from the people that we know that this process is going to impact. And I'm not saying that it has to be all or nothing. Like, I wonder if when the principals are in their draft stage, we can get some feedback, then we can share them with OSSE, then we can get some more feedback. But I don't think it has to be a one and done. And that's, I don't know, that's just a little concerning. And that's almost what I'm hearing. Like, we're trying to like either or. And to Alex's point, I think we can leverage this current tech moment if we need to. And there's enough of us where I think we can be creative enough to get actual community input before we're so far along in this process. So,
Reggie, can I ask you to say a little bit about your comment in the chat as well?
Sure. So I'm just listening. It's a lot.
Can't hear you too well, Reggie.
I'm sorry. I apologize. I have a lot going on. As I'm listening to the discussion, I'm really, I guess, thinking about, from a time perspective, because it seems as if we might need multiple rounds of public engagement. And I'm thinking that an initial round should not be something that has what we're thinking yet, but really trying to get a very general assessment of what the public is thinking. I think there was even a comment in the chat that, I'm trying to read what it said, that Sarah said, just general, like, what if we ask DC residents what they feel students need to know about social studies in order to graduate, or something just very like general about the state of social studies and what they want to learn, and kind of use that as a basis to modify what we might be thinking as guiding principles, and then maybe ask more about like the principles after we have them. So I'm kind of thinking about on the lines of what Laura was saying earlier, now really concerned about like, it seems like a little rush of a time crunch. And now that we're talking about this public engagement piece, in order to do the due diligence that is necessary, as was said by the previous speaker on the chat, excuse me, not in the chat, but that was commenting, that we need to have more rounds of feedback. And we need, the first round, I definitely do agree, needs to be general, if that makes sense.
Okay. I feel like that's come through really clear. I see lots of +1s, lots of thinking about the fact that asking a more general question, and Lamar, I think you said this as well, that we need earlier community input and then consistent. So we want to get it multiple times. I do think we've got a time crunch. We don't have any more time on our hands than we did 20 minutes ago in the discussion. So what I'm curious about here is whether there's an opportunity to ask this sort of general question, the question being, I'm seeing a couple of different ways it's written here in the standards, like feedback on social studies. What do you think students should know and be able to do in social studies by the time they graduate in DC? What questions do you have about the DC social studies standards? I think there's a number of different ways we could ask that. And we want to ask that sooner rather than later. We as a committee want to keep working on the guiding principles, and then we will share the guiding principles when they are further down the road. And we've got a sample set of who's talking about social studies that we can reach back out to ask for that feedback from. What I don't have a good answer to yet, and I'm not going to have an answer to in 2 minutes, is how to do this properly. So I'm going to ask a little grace to take everything that you've all offered in the chat and respond via email to this group with a couple of options, and then ask you all to tell me which one we should go with. It could mean that we push back our voting on these guiding principles. And I'm getting lots of text messages from my staff that says they're all in favor of us getting it right rather than us getting it on time. So I can certainly live with that. So I want to just repeat what I heard. We need to engage the public We want to do it consistently and several times. We want to make sure we start at a place where the public can access what we're asking them. And we ask them a general question first before we get nitty gritty and specific on things that we've been thinking a lot about, but they have not. And we want to make sure that we have enough time to really workshop these guiding principles amongst ourselves and get them right. I still think, given everything I heard, that Karen's suggested changes to the document make sense for us internally, as well as potentially for external sharing going forward. That Danielle's point still stands, that like we got to get down on paper, here's what we like about what's happening and what we want to keep. Here's philosophically our vision for this, and then here's specifics below it. So with those things, I'm going to ask you to do many of the same things I was asking you to do before, but I'm going to take away one of the things I was asking. So give me 1 second to share my screen one more time. So our next big group meeting together is October 13th, but you're going to hear from me between now and then. I would still like you to go back into this guiding principles document and keep working. Fill in places where we've got gaps. Still think about your top 10. What are your non-negotiables? What are the things you care deeply about, whether they be philosophical or explicit? I will take on reorganizing the guiding principles document to include this, what are we keeping, philosophical and explicit? And I will do that tonight, but you got to give me until tomorrow then to really dive in on reorganizing too much stuff. So don't you work on it tonight. You work on it starting tomorrow. Give me tonight to reorganize the document. But I'll ask you to keep doing those things. And then I'm going to talk with my staff so that we can come back over email to say, here's what we're suggesting for engaging the public in the ways we talked about. I saw lots of nods. I see some comments in here. It feels like folks are feeling good about more transparency, more engagement, more opportunities to dig in with the public. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and give you one last thought for the night. Thank you all for bearing with me on this, and thank you for being forthright. But this is how we get this to work together. Next Wednesday at 5:30, the state board has its public meeting, and we are going to have another panel of experts coming to talk to board members about the social studies. So if you can tune in live, feel free. We'd love to have you watching with us as we engage with panelists. If you aren't able to, we will make sure to send the link to the YouTube video to everybody on the SISAC so that you'll also get to hear from a few more experts. We're still refining the list, so I don't have names for you yet, but as soon as you do, we'll have it out. We'll send you the link to the meeting. We'll send you the link to the recording, and you'll get some more time with more experts. I so appreciate all of you giving your time. Second week of school, first or second week of digital learning for your own kids. Like, you're amazing. Thank you for being engaged, and thank you for pushing me. This is really helpful. I appreciate it. With that, we conclude meeting 3 of the Social Studies Standards Advisory Committee. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Jessica. Peace.
Thank y'all. Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everyone, for your work.
Jessica, you rock for taking this on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for being part of it. Bye, all.